Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Goldbert, the Executive Director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. We welcome you today to part one of a two-part webinar series entitled The Impact of the Israel-Hamas War on the Arab-Palestinian Community in Israel and Implications for Shared Society. This semester, we are continuing to explore the impact of war and the questions facing Israel and the region in several different ways. Bear with me while I share several upcoming events. In today's conversation, legal scholars Manal Totry-Jubran and Masua Sagiv will explore the impact of the Israel-Hamas war on the Arab-Palestinian community in Israel from a social, political, and legal perspective, with particular focus on discrimination, rights, and remedies, and the complexities of citizenship. On April 15th, in part two of this webinar series, education scholar Ayman Agbaria will continue this important conversation with Masua Sagiv from a civic educational perspective, with a focus on citizenship, education, religion, and belonging. In between, on March 19th, we will host a webinar with a panel of Israeli scholars examining key data from the February 2024 Israel Consensus Index, a representative national survey that measures attitudes and relationships within the Jewish and Arab Israeli population. In addition, we will have a two-part series on international law perspectives on the war. On April 1, we will examine Israel before international law mechanisms with international law scholars Yuval Shani and Elena Chachko. On April 10, we will zero in on the sexual and gender-based violence on October 7 and its aftermath with law and gender scholars Kochav El-Hayam Levi and Masua Sagiv. We will also continue our long tradition of programming in Jewish law, thought, and identity. On April 3rd, we will host in person our annual Robbins Collection Lecture on Jewish law, thought, and identity with Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Lastly, we continue to invest in our students with a cohort of 30 undergraduate fellows engaging in leadership training, including how to have difficult conversations and how to engage across difference, and planning relevant programs for their peers. Please refer to our website, social media, and our email blast for all of these upcoming programs and for recordings of past programs. All of the programs, activities, and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community, and we thank you for your continued support. Now I'm honored to introduce you to our guest speaker and moderator for today's program. Manal Totry-Jubran is an associate professor at Ilan University Faculty of Law. She is also a visiting professor at Bicocca University in Milan. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Law at Hebrew University, and she received her PhD from Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law. Her main fields of interest are law and society, legal geography, multiculturalism, minority rights, constitutional and administrative law, environmental and climate justice, and transitional justice. Professor Totry-Jubran has won numerous awards for her research, including the Segla Prize for Exceptional Legal Articles in Hebrew and the Gorney Prize for Excellent Young Researcher in Public Law. Professor Totry-Jubran was also the recipient of a prestigious 3-year research grant funded by the Israel Science Foundation on conceptualizing environmental justice in the Israeli legal and regulatory system. Masua Sagiv will moderate the conversation. The Helen Diller Institute has been blessed to host Professor Sagiv these past 3 years as the Kret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies. She is also the scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. We are hopeful to have her for next academic year as well. And as you heard, she is expertly moderating several programs for us this spring. Professor Sagiv researches and teaches on gender, religion and law, gender and Judaism, law and social change, and comparative constitutional law. And I'm happy to welcome both this moment.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this conversation. And thank you, Manal, for coming to this conversation. Manal is my old friend and colleague in Israel. And these are very difficult moments.
Indeed. Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. Thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this and for us to meet after so many devastating moments. So I really cherish this webinar. Thank you again for having me.
So Israel's population is combined of about 79% Jewish population and 21% Arab, Druze, Muslim, Christian population. And one of the crucial questions, and it's a social question and a cultural question and a legal question, and way before October 7th, is what place do Arab-Palestinians that are citizens of Israel have in a state that defines itself as the nation state of the Jewish people? What is, in what sense, the story of the country is their story as well? And then October 7th happens and the war in Gaza starts. And I think that I can identify two trends within Israeli Jews in Israel. The first trend, on the one hand, Hamas does not distinguish between Jews and Arabs as long as they're Israeli citizens on the 7th of October. And at the same time, we are seeing heightened solidarity and sacrifice by Arab-Palestinian Israelis towards their country, towards their people. We have several surveys. One of them, the Israeli Democracy Institute, conducted a survey that shows, I think it was in November or December, that shows an unprecedented percentage of 70% of Arab Israelis feel part of the state and its problems. That's something that we haven't seen ever, really. And Israeli Jews are seeing that and are moved by that. And on the other hand, a lot of Israeli Jews are scared. Many Israeli Jews consider or see Arab Palestinians that are citizens of Israel perhaps as part of their enemy. And it seems that in general, many Israeli Jews just prefer that Arab Palestinian will shed their national identity from them and maybe be, prefer, it's very quote unquote good Arabs. How do you see, Manal, these trends play out in the Arab-Palestinian community in Israel? What's the experience of Arab-Palestinians in Israel in the past 5 months? And do you see a change throughout the 5 months within this community?
Well, you just talked about the fear of the Jewish Israeli after the brutal attack and the massacre of the 7th of October. But I have to talk a little bit also about the fear of Palestinians inside of Israel. As you mentioned before, we are 20% of the state. About 80% of the 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel are Muslims who today started the Ramadan, the holy month of fasting before Eid al-Fitr, and 10% are Christians and 10% are Druze. Although Israel would like to categorize the Druze community as separate from the Arab community, but it is an integral part of the Palestinian community. So after the 7th of October, I have to say that I also felt great feelings of fear, but kind of a double fear, because on the one hand, as you said before, the attack was against Israelis as such. It was not only against Jews, it was against Israelis as the occupier. And on the 7th of October, Palestinians were also Muslims, mostly Muslim Palestinians were killed. Some were kidnapped. Some were killed while reaching out to help injured people. And so I had several of nights of sleepless nights and nightmares in which I dreamt that Hamas is coming to my house. I live in Haifa, by the way, on the north part of Israel, which is a mixed city in Israel where Jews and Arabs live side by side. I also live in a mixed neighborhood. I have Jewish neighbors, of course. And so I had some nightmares of having Hamas coming and attacking my house, burning my house, and kidnapping my kids. And other nights, I also had some nightmares from the calls of revenge from the Jewish part, from Jewish citizens who publicly also posted posts calling for revenge and actions for revenge against the Palestinians inside of Israel. And so this, the first 2 months were really very troubling physically, and I totally understand the fear of my Jewish my Jewish friends and colleagues and neighbors, and but people have to understand that I have kind of a double fear in this context. And now, regarding to the statistics, well, some very interesting trend was that kind of these people who were moved from our stand, our very clear stand against the brutal attack of the 7th of October. Well, I have to say that it was kind of offending for me. We are moral people, and we object to any action committed against civilians, even if it's under the name of freeing Palestine. For us, the cause does not justify in no circumstances the means. Okay, and this should not be any of surprise for anyone. We don't need a badge or we don't need a certificate of good conduct for being moral human beings. Okay, so I have to say that I kind of resent these stance for cheering up regarding our status. And so when you ask me about the attitudes of in the Palestinian population, well, after kind of getting over the first month, 2 months of being scared from revenge attacks or from Hamas and so on, well, after the brutal events of the 7th of October, there was a wave of aggressive actions committed by the police forces, leading to widespread arrests and detentions of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And by the way, I don't know how much you heard about it in the media, but also in the West Bank, thousands have been arrested in the West Bank, not talking about the people who were killed, about 400 who were killed. And so in some instances, not only Palestinians were arrested and detained, even left Jewish activists who shared content on social media were also arrested. So if you ask me about the attitude, we are totally scared, and we are totally even when I wrote you before, even now I'm like very precautious of what I'm saying even after stating my very obvious stand on the issue, right? Because what happened is after the 7th of October, people who shared clear shared posts that had concerns for Palestinian victims in Gaza by posting their names and their pictures were arrested the next day. All right, I'm not talking about a clear posts in favor of the attack and justifying Hamas's actions and celebrating it. This, for me, is not even freedom of speech. It's total indictment, and people should be detained and arrested for that. I'm talking about people who shared human, moral people who share their concerns about what is happening in Gaza. And so we are in a total position of, we are frightened, to express our solidarity. Like we can share videos and posts about the kidnaps, the hostages who are in Gaza, but we cannot post or share pictures or videos of what is happening in Gaza. And when I say we cannot, like we can, obviously, but the consequences are really harsh. So some of the consequences can be detained from or even fired in some cases. Doctors were head of sections in hospitals were fired without a hearing, without anyone talking with them at all. Students were detained suspended. Sorry, that were suspended from the campuses. So we have this on the social side, in a sense that people were kind of punished by their bosses, where the places that they work in. But the more troubling thing is the policy of the enforcement system, which had a very clear policy of indicting, detaining, and arresting people who posted, as I said before, any posts regarding solidarity with Gaza. So we're living moments of R in some cases, because we are bleeding and we are hurting for the casualties in this horrible war from Israel and from Gaza, and we cannot say anything. So, and this is really devastating. And me as a scholar, I have to say, like, I'm a constitutional scholar who I teach about the importance of freedom of speech as not only a constitutional right, but also a basic human right. And now I understand it's not a theoretical right. It's a kind of a psychological right, because I can't do anything with everything bad that is happening. So let me just at least voice my voice. Let me at least pay my solidarity. And well, as I said before, even left activist Jews were arrested. And just to give you an example, there was a civic teacher who was also a left Jewish activist who was arrested in November from his house and brought the next day for an extension of the detention, just for posting on Facebook, showing the faces and the names of Palestinian children and their parents who were killed by the IDF bombing. This is for the Jew, and this is a Jewish citizen, all right? And there was another case. There are hundreds of cases, by the way, according to Adala, which is the legal center for promoting the Arab rights of the Palestinians in Israel. There's hundreds of cases as such. But another very frustrating case was of Ahmed Khalifa, who was a lawyer, who has 3 kids. He's not a terrorist, and he's not a pro-Hamas attack or anything. He was just arrested on the 19th of October while simply demonstrating and delivering a speech against the war. This is what people do in demonstrations. People go out and demonstrate in order to express their opinions, their stand against the policy of the government, whether we are in war, whether we are in a emergency situation, and so on. So he gave a speech against the war, calling for a ceasefire, and he was arrested for 16 weeks. And he was not really released. He was just transferred to a house arrest after the 16 weeks of jail. And the offense was of identifying with a terrorist organization. So the thing is that now every post is interpreted as identifying with Hamas. So even if you express your solidarity with Gaza, which not all of them are Hamas, even according to the statistics, even if we take half of the casualties that were killed since the beginning of the war Hamas, we still have about 15,000 people who are civilians, who are innocent people, and so the situation is really difficult regarding freedom of speech.
So you said a few things here. If I'm trying to categorize some of the things that you've said, you've talked about just in the most basic sense, the experiences, the feelings that we are, and I'm bringing our audience here because our audience have North American lens, and a lot of the times when we speak about Israel, people here think about Jews in Israel, and there's a very a significant portion of the population is not Jewish. So first, just to understand the basic notion and the basic feeling, and then you've talked about voice and as gender, as people who also deal with gender, we know how a voice is so important, and the limitation or the canceling or the taking of the voice, what it does even before we get to the legal legal issues. And then you've talked about discrimination and specific cases of discrimination. And what I thought was very interesting is that it's how law is used and how law is interpreted in a way that gives very few options to someone who holds an identity of an Arab-Palestinian citizen of Israel and who tries to voice it. But one second, before we go into the examples, some of the examples that you shared, I think is really interesting. But before we go to the examples, it feels to me that this is all a part of an old question in Israel that is just, it's heightened these days. And this is the question of citizenship and nationality. Because in Israel, nationalities, citizenship are both separate, but also very much intertwined. Because on the one hand, we have cases of Israeli Supreme Court that says there's no such thing as an Israeli nationality that is separate from a Jewish nationality, meaning there's no difference between citizenship, between nationality and religion, and we know that in Judaism, religion and nationality are very closely intertwined. But on the other hand, when citizenship, when it's very, very thin, it doesn't give a lot. I'll give an example. For me as an Israeli Jew, I know that the story of the country is also my story, is also my cultural story, my historic story, my identity. And this is something that not everyone in Israel, for Arab-Palestinians, they don't have this story. So supposedly Arab-Palestinians have citizenship and everyone has exactly the same citizenship. That's not exactly the case, right, Manal? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, after the basic law of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, things were complicated ever since the establishment of the state, and this basic law even complicated things even more, because now legally or constitutionally even, Israel is Moledet, is the homeland of the Jews. And if that's so what about me? And a lot of people just used to answer is that this basic law only regards the Jewish people. It doesn't regard other people. But when you define or demarcate the boundaries of the community, of the political community, you necessarily also decide who's in and who's out. And when you decide that this homeland is only for the Jewish people, this leaves me out. And this is my homeland too, historically. So legally, I will not get into the basic law too much here, but there are a lot of aspects in this basic law that are discriminatory, and in some cases also racist. But and most people regard specifically the section about the language, the Jewish language, as being the formal language of the state. And the issue of the settlement, for me, the most troubling, this connecting to what you said before, the most troubling issue is actually Section 1 of Basic Law, which defines this space as the homeland of the Jewish people. And I know the historical story about the historical religious right and so on. Me as secular Christian, I do not relate too much with the religious historical rights. I do relate to the current present situation in which you and I are living here, and we both have now the right to live here, regardless of any historical events that happened before. And so, with that said, I will say also that whereas Jews know exactly who they are, and Palestinians that live in the occupied territories and in Gaza also know exactly who they are, we experience much more complex reality. We are kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Our citizenship is constantly being under examination by Israel, as well as the same time our loyalty to our people. So you have to understand that, like, I personally know people that were evacuated from the settlements, the Israeli settlements from Israel after the events of the 7th of October. I also know people who were evacuated in Gaza. We know people who were killed from both sides. So being a Palestinian Israeli is a very difficult and complex job. I wish I could be or this or that, but and now relating to your issue of the story, right? So the War of 48, what I learned in schools, and what my children are learning now in school, has nothing to do with my heritage or my history, which also includes the Nakba, which also includes the ruined villages and cities that were demolished totally after the establishment or during the establishment of the state. And now this is a very integral part of who I am. A very integral part of who I am is that my grandfather fled to Beirut in 48 and could not come back after Israel was established. So he came back kind of illegally. It is defined as illegal coming back to Israel from Beirut, because after the establishment of Israel, every people who were outside the borders of Israel were defined as enemies, so they could not come back. So he kind of came back illegally. But I do not really like to use this term, because he came back to his house. He came back to Haifa. He came back to his homeland. And so this terminology of coming back illegally is, I think it's problematic. So, but this is part of my story, and this I cannot push it back. I cannot ignore it. And talking about my story, and this is one very important thing that I think every Jew should understand. Talking about my story does not mean that it does not mean river to the sea. That does not mean that I want to throw now all the Jews in the sea. Not at all. Talking about my story is just talking about who I am. And again, as I said before, and I stress that again, we are now all living here together, and we have to find a common interest and a common future to live together. But we cannot do that unless you also hear my part of the story. I'm 20% of the people here. And so the thing is that also when my Jewish friends and students, even my students in Bar Ilan, hear me or hear me presenting myself, identifying myself as Palestinian, they are shocked. In some cases, they are even insulted, because ever since the establishment of the state, we are referred to as Arab-Israelis, kind of a new nation. Like there's the Arab nation, so we have Syrians, so we have Lebanese, so we have Jordanians, and we have Israelis. But as soon as, and this is the amazing thing that was even crystallized in after the 7th of October, but it was true all the time. After every security event or military event that occurred, we like that become Palestinians in the eyes of the state and in the eyes of my Jewish fellows. So after a military operation, we turn, as I said, to immediate suspects. And again, this was very much clarified and crystallized after the 7th of October, because we were targeted. We were targeted even when we shared posts about just paying our solidarity or expressing our solidarity. People were again targeted for past posts from 2 and 3 years ago. Why? Because like never mind that I identify myself as Palestinian, because eventually even the state and most of the Jewish people identify me as Palestinian, which is fine, but it's kind of a contradictory status, you know? So
it's okay for them to define you as Palestinian, but if you define yourself as a Palestinian, then it's wrong, because then, oh, what does it mean about your feelings about us, in a sense, about us? And yeah,
exactly.
And it's also interesting. I'll just add one data here. It's in 2019, there was a very big academic survey done about Israeli Judaism by JPPI, and there was one question there, or how much do you identify with the following? And it was something like, in order to be an Israeli, you have to be a Jew. And you would see something like 91% of Arab-Palestinian Israelis are saying, no, that's not the case. But then you see something like 77% of Israeli Jews in different levels, right? But in different levels agree to that statement. So on the one hand, people are saying you should be Arab Israelis. That's, by the way, a lot of the times when I teach about Israel, and I use the term Arab Israeli citizens of Israel, I also get pushback. And you know, I prefer to allow people define themselves subjectively, and not me to define how they see themselves. I find it as the right thing. But I think you said something very, very powerful when you say, when you want, you define me as Palestinian, but if it's not comfortable for you, I cannot be a Palestinian. And I think it's very, very powerful.
Well, you have to also, like, just to emphasize that the only difference between me living now in Haifa and my parents and my grandfathers from both sides were born here. Both my grandfathers were born before 48, right? Before the establishment of the state. And the only difference between me and the refugees in the refugee camps in Gaza, specifically refugee camps in Gaza who are now evacuated again and becoming again refugees, and who were mostly originated from mixed cities, other mixed cities like Ramle, like Lod, just near Tel Aviv. The only difference is that their grandfather left in 48 and mine stayed here. And so I might as well have been also there if the circumstances were different. So to make things more complicated, so as I said before, I'm a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and in some cases I feel more of this, in some cases I feel more of that. Like a very dear close friend of mine lost her son, who was a soldier in Mutzav Azikim in the first day of the war, and we cried together. And I know families who were killed and evacuated in Gaza. My friends, my students are serving now in Gaza, are serving their military service in Gaza. My friends' husbands are in the north, and so it's not only, as I said in the beginning, that my fear is kind of double, but also my worries in some sense are doubled, because I clearly worry for everyone who's involved. I really don't like using the word sides, because I don't think there are sides in war. In war, there is only one side in which everyone are victims and casualties of the war. So yeah, I worry. I suffer the suffering of all the people who are involved, because I'm literally in contact with these people. Some are my people, and others are. It's not even my neighbor. It's kind of like you are part of
Your
me.
people as well, in a sense.
My people as well. And so, but it's like, as you said before, I can't be part of your people, because your people is only the Jewish people. And I have to say that after the 7th of October, this was something that really disappointed me, because a lot of my Jewish kind of liberal left-wing friends, whom I felt like they are really part of my people, part of my civic reality. And so when we talk about citizenship, we also talk about these daily experiences. Suddenly I became a stranger to them. I'm no longer part of their people. And so in the recent years, I started more investigating the essence of citizenship, because being a Palestinian in a Jewish state that defines itself as a Jewish state, but also democratic, where there are some liberal aspects of democracy in Israel. I would not deny that. But again, after the basic law, we have inferiority, more enriched in a constitutional level. And even if the Supreme Court of Justice several times declared that as an essential part of the essence of citizenship, which is freedom of speech, is one of the basic stones of the democratic system of Israel, is still, first of all, freedom of speech is not enriched in any basic law in Israel, as you know. But also the problem is that citizenship, well, I focus on the lived experience of citizenship, meaning that it's not enough that I have a formal right to express or to execute my freedom of speech. The exam or the exam should be, or the question should be, whether I actually do that, whether I'm actually feel secure enough to do that. And I don't feel secure enough to do that. Again, even here, I don't feel totally secure enough, because even if before the 7th of October, like I could not be promoted, or I could have some hostile attitude from students, and so on. So there are also informal actions that could also affect the essence of citizenship. And if again we're talking about lived experience of citizenship, one of the main things is the issue of belonging. And I feel over and over again in every, again, a military operation and war, I'm being reminded that I don't belong. You're not part of this ethos of the togetherness. Okay, so yeah.
This is, again, I'm just thinking as you are speaking, this really fleshes out the gap between the law as it's written or the law in the books and the law in effect, or the experiences in effect. No, and I've also thought throughout, I've been doodling since or writing or whatever. Everyone on the audience will have to be patient with our English. That there's also a difference. There's a reason why we have laws that will sometimes limit our emotions, our emotional reactions, right? So when we're very, 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 very scared, or where we're incredibly angry, or when we were grieving, and we had all of this after the 7th of October, but we should have the law that will guide us on how we should react or how we shouldn't react. And freedom of speech is definitely one of those laws. Can you, as a legal scholar, you work on zoning and on planning, and you've mentioned a few times during your words mixed cities and different communities in Israel. Can you just speak a bit about how everything that you've said so far, and maybe some of the discriminations that you've been talking about, have been playing out in specific neighborhoods or cities,
Yeah.
or regions?
Okay, well, I'll have to add just one comment to your conclusion or your summary. You talked about the law and the society, but I think that there's another sphere now that coming in, specifically in this very right-wing racist government, and this is policy.
Yeah.
And specifically Ben Gvir's policy. So because as I said before, nothing has changed legally regarding the freedom of speech regulation, and in general, what changed is the policy of
the enforcement, really.
The enforcement policy.
The choices on enforcement and interpretation of the specific laws. Yeah.
Exactly. So yes, exactly. So now, under emergency laws that gave the police unprecedented arrest powers, now we have kind of a different situation. So if I will give you an example of a test case that I've been researching recently, and it's about a Palestinian citizen of northern Israel. She's a neuro scientist and a folk singer known in the Arab world. She's married to a doctor. She has two kids and lives in the mixed city that I refer to as the mixed city in the making, just to say in short. So we have the mixed cities, historical mixed cities, like the one I live in, which is Haifa, Ramle, Lod. These are cities that were mixed ever since, even before the establishment of the state. And we have mixed cities in the makings, which are new cities, new mixed cities that have been evolving as such in the last 2 or 3 decades. All right, mainly we don't see a move from the Jewish community to the Arab region. Obviously, most of the move that we witness is of Arab well-established families to Jewish neighboring cities for several reasons. I don't have time to get into that now. But what is interesting, what happened with Dalal Abu Amri is that on the 7th of October, she posted a post which said, La ghalib illallah, la ghalib illallah. The translation of this sentence is the only victor is God. Now, the only thing also is that her social media, her social media team located in Egypt, added a Palestinian flag to this message. And this kind of complicated things for her life. She, by the way, on the same day, she called her Jewish friends, asking for their well-being after the attack. Some of whom she also known from the south part of Israel. But what happened is, after she posted this post, death threats started to come on social media, on phone calls, and finally also in protest in front of her doorstep. Now, Jewish Israeli citizens threatened to rape her, to burn her house down, to kill her two children, to get her husband fired, and they also tried to do that from his job as a deputy director of a local hospital in Nahariya. And the most troubling and devastating thing is that when she went to the police station in order to file a complaint against these harassment, she was arrested by the police, and the police stated that that this post is indictment, and it's part of justifying the act of Hamas. After 3 days, she was released, but again, even after she was released, after 3-4 days, protests till now, five months after this event, are continuing to happen. And what is interesting,
outside of her home, right?
Protests outside of her home, with the corporation of the mayor of Afula, the next cities. Now, just to give you a small background, these mixed cities, particularly Afula, was not very welcomed by the Jewish community in Afula. And what happened after the 7th of October, this unwelcoming approach started to be more institutionalized, because the mayor of Afula is part of this demonstration, and even the enforcement system is kind of part of this this process. Because even when she called the police to come and stop the demonstrations outside of her house, they said that this is freedom of speech. Surprise, surprise. They have the right to demonstrate and to do that. So what is interesting here, when I look about this issue specifically, again, I remind you that the sentence was, the only victor is God. And this new policy of the enforcement system, guided by the Minister of Interior, Nationality, how you call them, National Security.
Yep.
National Security of Ben-Gvir, even ambiguous posts that has nothing to do with Hamas or with the war, the only victor is God, that's it, can be now a base for trying to evacuate people from their house, to displacing people from their house. And what is more troubling is this cooperation between the enforcement system, the local government, and racists, activists. And so we see that there's a move from a discriminatory policy into a racist policy, even without changing any laws, just changing the policy of
the enforcement, you mean?
The enforcement of the law, exactly.
Yeah. When you look at all of those cases, and when you take into consideration everything that you have described so far, how do you see the way moving forward from this? Or what are some, can you identify what are the keys both to fighting this specific discrimination or the specific discriminate enforcement that you've described, but also in more general, how do you see Israeli society in general moving forward into a future that will be, you know, inclusive and even, you know, have a possible place for Arab-Palestinians who are citizens of Israel?
Well, Masua, I'm not sure I have something clever or optimistic to say in this regard, actually, at this point of time, at this stage. And I think that I also share my feelings are very similar to also my Jewish friends and colleagues. It's not only the our feeling as a minority. As I said before, people are very scared. They feel very trapped. More and more are thinking of leaving Israel. My son, who's 19 years old, is already moving towards that step, and this really devastates me. But he's one of many young men who are trying to find their future elsewhere, and this is really devastating. So when you ask me about how to move forward, the problem is that 5 months ago we moved backwards. I don't know if decades, but we moved backwards very much and very quickly. And during these 5 months, we have moved even more backward because the war in Gaza. I don't know how can we go back from where we are now, considering the numbers of victims, the numbers of devastation and destruction, and so on. So I'm really I'm trying to find something to think clearly about some sort of a future from both sides, right? Because both sides feel very, when we talk about the Jews and when we talk about the Palestinians in Gaza, and also we are in these both trapped in these between both. But I think that well, if you want me to have some guidelines, the first thing is that we should acknowledge the fact that we are in this together. Again, Palestinians were also kidnapped, were also killed, also tried to be, even after the 7th of October, when people tried also to help injured people, even the Palestinian community even opened their houses in order to have their evacuation. I think that another very important guideline, other than that we are in this together, is that the Jewish community has to acknowledge that the situation in the West Bank and in Gaza cannot go as it was before any longer. It is part of our reality, not me as a Palestinian, even you as a Jewish Israeli. It's our reality, it's our lived experience. When your neighbor is not feeling, even if we talk about let's take a micro case, like literally my neighbor next door. If my neighbor next door is suffering from something I did or something that we both did, I'm not going to get into now the historical who did what and what, but if he is suffering or I am suffering from a particular situation, so I have to understand that I cannot just shut my door and live my happy life in my four walls and this sort of democracy or whatever. I'm an integral part of him and he's an integral part of me. And so we have to address and we have to deal with what is happening and resolve the situation. I cannot conduct a conversation if you're talking about a shared shared future, I do not want to have any relation or a conversation with a person who justify in any sense what happened on the 7th of October. And at the same token, I cannot also have any shared future with a person who can justify totally what's happening in Gaza. So we have to have a shared moral basic in order for us to move on. We cannot justify one situation and not justify another. So and just to relate about your last one of your comments, we have to know each other's stories and not being threatened by it. Just to know that this is part of who I am, this is part of who you are, and this what makes this what might make this place work for a better future.
Thank you, Manal. We're getting a lot of questions. Some of them we already discussed during our conversation, but I do want to try to fit in 2 to 3 questions if we can. There's a question about the context of war and law in the context of war, and if there was an example that during the American Civil War there were some limitations to free speech. The question is whether the context of war permits, in your opinion, constitutional limitations to free speech, and how and if and how this should look like.
Well, in some point, this was Netanyahu's also response that look what happened in the US after the attack of September 11th. I'm not sure that this is the place that I want to have lessons after emergency times. A limitation in every emergency situation, there will be limitations of rights. That's for sure. The thing is, what are the limitations of these limitations? This is one. And what are the essence of these limitations? So yes. one of the limitations were prohibiting a demonstration in al-Fahim just a month after the war. al-Fahim is an Arab city, one of the biggest Arab cities. The demonstration was supposed to be held inside of al-Fahim, and this was prohibited at all. So I think that this is an extreme limitation that I don't think that it can be justified. And even a month ago in Haifa, the court allowed to have a limited demonstration while limiting the number of demonstrators and also limiting the movement of demonstrators. So I think that these limitations infringe too much on human rights. And there's another very important issue that is really troubling, is that we see the limitation on freedom of speech only on the Palestinian minority. We don't see any limitation regarding Jews who posted indictment against
Gaza, for example.
And for ruining Gaza. There were no arrests, there were no interrogations, no detention, nothing. And by the way, even the ICJ regarded this issue in its decision and called to take all measures to prevent and punish direct and public incitement to commit genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. Okay? So the problem here is that if you want to ban my freedom of speech, to ban freedom of speech against all citizens of Israel. The problem here is that it was a very selective, it is still a very selective freedom of speech limitation. So if you apply this equally in all citizens, I can kind of live with that. But you're not doing that. I'm talking about the enforcement system. And this is one of the most problematic things.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to this, recalling your differentiation before between law and enforcement and then society and the citizens. It's we have the legal aspect that if correct me if I'm wrong, was there a change, an amending of the laws specifically, or was it just enforcement? Nothing was amended, right?
No, nothing was changed.
Yeah, nothing was amended. So it's really it's the middle level in a sense. And I have to say, when I'm thinking about, my heart in a sense goes out to those, the Israeli police force had great losses on the 7th of October, and is trying to encompass both, its goal, its mission to keep people safe and keep order and safety. And on the other hand, it's definitely, it's very apparent that the police is very much influenced by the spirit of the commander, in quote unquote. I mean, it's very, you see that again when Ben-Gvir controls, when Minister Ben-Gvir controls the police, you see it on the ground. And as you said, you really see it on a different scale towards Jews and towards Palestinians, or towards right wing, as opposed to towards left wing, which is definitely something that we've been seeing. Hold on. Okay, so this is in general, as you probably know, university campuses have turned in the US to very complicated places for Jewish students, but in general too. Could you please elaborate? We're getting a question. Could you please, from our colleague Rami Zidan, Professor Rami Zidan, could you please elaborate on the situation on Israeli university campuses, especially in relation to Palestinian students and Palestinian faculty members?
Yeah, well, the situation is very devastating in the Israeli campuses. I have to say that I was kind of relieved that I don't have any, that my son will not be next year in an Israeli campus. I wouldn't want him to be in this toxic situation. So what happened immediately after the 7th of October, Palestinian students, particularly in Haifa University, were expelled with no hearing, nothing. They just received a letter that they are expelled from the universities for different kinds of posts, right? Again, most of them are ambiguous posts. I'm not talking about posts, real clear posts that are indicting, but I'm talking about really vague posts. Some was, well, I will give you an example of my student that was not detained, but was threatened by other Jewish students. So we have several levels. We have the level of the institutional level, that the campus, that the administration of the campuses expelled students. In some cases at Haifa University, they were also arrested detained by the police after the university approached the police with some claim. And we have also another level, which is the level of harassment of Jewish students towards Palestinian students. And I think that we have it in all campuses, even in our campus, which is very quiet campus, I must say, in Bar Ilan. When we talk about the administrative approach, but when we talk about harassments against the Palestinian students, we have harassments done by the Jewish students. So there were also a lot of seker. How do you say seker?
A what?
Seker.
Survey.
Survey being conducted. Well, I don't know if you know, but the opening of the universities were postponed for 2 months. So during
Yep.
these 2 months, there was a survey committed with the Palestinian students in the campuses, and about 80% stated that they are very scared to come back to the campus. You have to also take under consideration that after Ben Gvir's new policy of just distributing weapons without a lot of supervision, so there's a lot of weapons in the campuses. There's a lot of weapons in the public sphere in general, right? So people are really scared. People are really scared to come to the campus, and they are kind of taking advantage of the thing is that now we have to all of our classes we teach frontally, but we also had to teach through Zoom because of the soldiers in the war. So we have the soldiers are not coming, and also the Palestinians are not coming because they are scared. So the situation is even more troubling because we have these two levels of the administrative level and also the social level in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Do you think maybe I'll try to bring in a few questions. This will be our last question. Do you think that we've been getting some questions about shared society, and you've talked about some of the guidelines, but can you think of legal measures that you can think of that will help us in promoting us towards shared society? Or do you think this is more something that will come from civil society rather than, will it be bottom up or top bottom, and what measures would you think should be adopted?
Okay, it should be bottom up and bottom down. It should be both ways. This is for sure. The second is on the legal level. Well, this is a solution that one of my best friends, she's an attorney specialized in human rights. She suggested, and I really I think that this is the first step in making things or having a chance for a future, for a shared future, which is dropping all the indictments that were submitted against the Palestinian citizens. Again, since it was a very selective enforcement, this can be a first step in the right way. This has been done even before, during the disengagement. If you remember, there was all the incitements were also dropped. Just
against the Jewish Israelis that protested the disengagement from Gaza. Yes.
Exactly. And there were also riots. Now we're not talking about riots. We are talking about simply, and again, I'm talking only about a posts in the social media that are not indicting posts, are not. I'm not talking about posts that are pro-Hamas and so on. This is another story. I'm talking about people who were charged for criminal charges for posting 3 years ago something about Ramallah, or I'm talking about these things. I'm talking about students that shared their solidarity to what's happening in Gaza. This is what I'm talking about. And I think that the first step legally, and that will also create a new or give a sense of security and trust in the legal system and in the enforcement system, is that to just stop, say, listen, we went crazy after the 7th of October. We saw you as immediate suspects. We were wrong. We take this back. But to continue this process is just to look at me as a constant criminal just because of my national belonging, my national affiliation, particularly in a time of war. So what kind of a shared future would you want from me? What kind of a joint discourse or conversation would you expect me to have?
This is when you said this last sentence, I found it so tragic that at some point during the demonstrations that were happening here in the university after October 7th against the war, at some point I stood before my students and I said, you know what, it doesn't matter who I am. I'm perceived as a criminal just because of my national identity as an Israeli. And I think we are living in such a binary period of time where I just read this morning that that an essay of a Jewish Israeli writer about coexistence, very, very critical towards the Israeli government, very, very critical towards the war. It was retracted from a literature magazine because it was called Apologia for Zionism, so-called. And what I think that what I would say as my if I would have asked myself what are the guidelines to moving forward, I would say exactly hearing and voicing your voices like yours, Manal, that show the complexity of the issue, that show, you know, when at some point you said like these are my people, but these are also kind of like my people. And to challenge the binary of the discourse. And of course that in Israel for Arab-Palestinians, this is much more serious because I'm very uncomfortable right now, but Arab-Palestinians in Israel are also actually unsafe and not just uncomfortable. So I just, you know, I wish all of us to have the ability to hear much more voices like your voice. And I want to thank you for having this conversation and for coming today and for speaking very bravely, I think, and very nuanced in a very nuanced way, and challenging a lot of us hearing, which I'm sure, you know, some of the things that you've said were a bit difficult for me too, and I'm sure that for other people as well, but they're so incredibly important to hear. So thank you, everyone. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to step back in to say thank you too. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Manal. Thank you so much.
Can I just say a sentence? I would also like to thank you very much. I've been silent for too long time. And this was a very devastating process for me just to stay silent. I started just talking just 2 weeks ago. And I have to say that I do feel psychologically relieved. So I really would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity. And just to say a word about binary, we all live on a daily basis on a binary world. What can change this binary world is mixed cities. When we live with each other, when we learn with each other, and we just simply understand that you and I are mothers or children, we worry the same worries, we have the same aspirations and wishes for our children. Despite the fact that you're a Jew, you are religious, I'm secular, I'm Palestinian, that doesn't matter. But by the end of the day, we share too many things. And the things that differentiate us, I think, are much less than the things that we have in common. So thank you again for this session.
I want to thank you both. I think it also speaks to the heart of friendship and trust that you can have this conversation. Manal, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with so much honesty and vulnerability, as well as complexity and clarity. And Masua, you are very skilled as a moderator and as a humanist. And I thank you both. As I said, we've been blessed to have Masua for several years, and we hope to have her next year. And Manal, we hope to host you in person for a longer period. So please keep that in mind as well. And thank you both, and thank you to all of you who attended.
Thank you.